Well, thank you very much indeed. If I walk over here, can you hear me? That microphone working okay? No? Yep, it's on. How about now? No? Right, I'll speak into this other mic for a little while. Something was working there. First of all, thank you very much, Kevin, for the kind introduction. And I'd like to thank Shane Pill and Rick Baldock, Alison Turner and the Program Committee for bestowing on me the honour of presenting the 2017 Fritz Duras Memorial Lecture. A special thank you too to ACHPER Event and Communications Manager Rhiannon Dodd and the team that she's got together for the wonderfully efficient manner in which the conference was arranged. I would also like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and they were the Ngunnawal people. This particular lecture is a little bit unusual for me because I don't usually do formal lectures. I like just walking around and having a chat to everybody. But in this particular situation, I've decided to do it a little bit differently, and there will be some formal aspects of this paper, and I want to read something to make sure, for a start, that I don't go over time. But I can't help myself. And I've got to tell you one little story, which I only decided to tell you while I was sitting down there as Alison came up. It was in 1981, and I must admit that this year marks the year that I've spent exactly half my life in Canberra and half my life in Melbourne. If I tell you the number of years, that's not going to sound pretty, but it's just over 35. So I can sort of think about myself as being a Canberran and a Melburnian on equal terms. And it sort of comes out in what I'll talk about later on. But in 1981, up the back we've got Galen Clues, who in her own right was a top triathlete and now is going to speak to us tomorrow. But in this particular occasion, I was running along with Galen's brother, Graham. And a group of the other runners were there. There's Rob DeCostello, a lot of really good runners, and I was hanging around up the back. But they were going fairly slow this time. And I decided that I would give them a little bit of physiology to try and talk to these people about the way that physiologists might be able to help runners. It was very, very new in those days. And Graham was running along, and as he was running along, he was making a strange noise through his nose and mouth. And I thought, what's going on here? This is an in for the new physiologist, Telford, at the Australian Institute of Sport. And I went into a fairly deep conversation about the physiology of breathing, what that does to get oxygen to the muscles, what happens if you don't breathe correctly, and the build-up of lactic acid and all those sorts of things that we're starting to measure in those athletes. And Graham, in his wisdom, and Rob DeCostello and a lot of the other runners were listening intently as we were running along, until Graham said, "Dick, that's really important. It's really lovely for you to tell us all about those physiological responses to running. However, the reason I'm going is I've got these new glasses and they slip down my nose and got to get them back up again." And that introduces the usual way that I speak, to keep things as simple as possible and look for the simple things first. And that was one of the best philosophies that I ever had through the days of the Institute of Sport, in which I spent around 25 years. So, Bear with me because the first part is going to be formal, there'll be a little less formal and so on. To avoid my dangerous tendency to speak for hours on anything related to physical activity, sport and physiology, I've divided the presentation up into 5 time-limited chapters. The first takes us back in time, a fairly long time. And takes me back to my childhood days to provide a glimpse of life back then, especially in relation to the way we kids moved around. The second chapter recalls some of the salient observations by physical educators about physical education itself. The third and fourth chapters review where we stand in providing the kind of evidence required to convince educational policymakers to pay due respect and more attention to the discipline of physical education. And the fifth chapter describes a realistic system that we think, in our team, might give primary school physical education an overdue shot in the arm. While the setting of this presentation is primary school and pre-adolescent children, there are clear implications for physical education at the similarly malleable, albeit markedly different, developmental stage of adolescence. Moreover, as alluded to by previous Duras Memorial lecturer and distinguished physical educator David Kirk, if children receive high-quality physical education during their primary school years, then they are likely to derive greater benefits from the secondary school programs. It's 1964. In year 2 of the Melbourne University Diploma of Physical Education, and I was one of 40 students in the old education theatre. The course was of 2 years' duration, but it packed 3 or 4 years of psychology, sociology, anatomy, physiology, biomechanics, motor learning into, I'd say, 5.5 days, because we always had to come in on Saturday morning before I went down to play footy, into each university week. It proved to be, as I look back, the most influential course I was ever to take, that diploma course, generating my interest in the physiology and biochemistry studies that I undertook over the following 8 years, a full-time equivalent at that same university. We were an enthusiastic group of physical education disciples, with our leaders adopting styles ranging from old-school regimented discipline to new exploratory pedagogy. Strangely enough, these styles of lecturers were seemingly conflictory but complementary. Apart from a brief period of elevation to degree status prior to extinction in the early 80s, that phys ed 2-year diploma course at Melbourne University was destined to remain at diploma level. This was partly because it was overwhelmed by a new wave of physical education and movement science, led predominantly by Australians returning as graduates of USA universities, especially to the University of Western Australia being at the forefront, and in Victoria itself by 2 new institutes of technology called Preston and Footscray in the old days. We've got Elaine Murphy here, I think, somewhere from Footscray. And 2 College of Advanced Education, Rusden and Burwood. On the other hand, we DIP Phys Ed students had the distinct impression that our course director, ex-Navy officer and amateur boxer, Dr. A.W. Burt, as we knew him, Willie, did little to ingratiate himself or the discipline of physical education within the inner circle of professorial fellows at Melbourne University. We easily imagined our inimitable Burt pointing out to the medical faculty staff that they might do well to heed the views of physical educationists when it came to the prevention of chronic disease. He was probably right. In fact, he was definitely right. But we also got the impression that the academic diplomacy wasn't really one of Dr. Willie's strong suits. Anyway, today's lecture is special. It's being delivered, it's the lecture I'm attending, 1964, being delivered by a man we'd heard about but had not met, as he had retired from his formal academic duties. In retrospect, this lecture must have been close to, if not the last he would deliver, as he died the following year. His name was Dr. Fritz Duras, the renowned architect of our course of study, that Diploma of Physical Education course, which at the time of inception, as mentioned previously by Shane, was the only physical education course conducted at any Australian university. Very pleased to see the original. Must be worth millions. I'd never seen the original, but I'd seen that one. Dr. Duras, 1896 to 1965, clearly deserves being referred to as the father of physical education, and his words of wisdom reflected his former role of a physician who clearly understood the relationships between the body, mind and quality of life. Previous Duras memorial lecturer, Kirk Tinningham, among the two of them, and his biographer, Kentish, and that I think is on the front of your Gertrude Kentish's book, have provided a comprehensive picture of the role Dr. Duras played in developing the physical education profession in Australia. I'm not going to dwell further on the man's influence here, but I'm going to keep two very fond memories of that lecture in 1964 I referred to the end of my presentation. Some reminiscence. In my youth in the 1950s, I was always fascinated by stories of the olden days, of life 60 years prior. Around the turn of the 20th century would have been for me at that stage. What a strange life it must have been 60 years ago when I was a 10-year-old. Life without radio stations, which I didn't think I could do without. The occasional movie theatre, or my two-wheeler bike. And fancy Collins Street in Melbourne being full of horses in carts around the turn of the 20th century. And houses that had no indoor toilets, although at the time where we lived we didn't have one either. To a kid in the 1950s, people of the early 20th century even looked like people from a different species. Now the shoe's on the other foot. Here's the old-timer. To some of you, the 1950s must be as obscure as the 1950s must be as obscure, mysterious and alien as the 1900s were to me at that time. But 1955 to me seems just the other day. And given that we often hear from our elders that, inverted commas, in my day we used to be much more active than kids nowadays, I thought it might be of interest to reflect on elements of my life as a 10-year-old, circa 1955, especially how the relaxed simplicity of life meant that physical activity just happened. Parkville is an inner suburb of Melbourne. We rented that house on the corner right there. It was one of the cheapest places to live in Melbourne at the time. My mother's family had rented that house since the late 19th century. Over the road was a place called Camp Pell. It was an old army campsite, but now with run-down temporary army hut zero-star accommodation for around 3,000 soldiers who returned from World War II without any way to support themselves. The press called it Camp Hell. So did my mum and dad for a while, because I wasn't allowed to go over there at all for fear of being bitten by dogs with rabies. Not anymore though. That same site, Camp Pell, is called Royal Park and houses the famous Royal Children's Hospital. My primary school, fortunately, was nowhere near Camp Pell, but was a strange little setup, being the Melbourne Teachers College Rural Practising School. And that was in the corner of the University of Melbourne. The school was a weatherboard structure tucked in behind the Teachers College shown in that slide, in the corner of it's Grattan Street and Swanston Street, Melbourne University, for those familiar. The little school had 3 rooms. Well, the little building had 3 rooms, each representing a separate school. In each school, there were 6 tables. And at each table, for 5 or 6 children, was a separate grade of grade 1 to grade 6. I moved from grade 1 to grade 6 in the same school, if you like, which was the same room. There was never a thought of being driven to school. At that stage, my father was a World War II returned soldiers university scholarship holder, and we couldn't afford a car until I was in grade 4. However, we got one like that. It was a second-hand, it's not that exact one, but exactly that model, a second-hand, only a year old as I recall, Holden FX with a number plate which seems to be inexplicably indelible in my mind of NT924. Everyone walked to the school though, not just me, even after we got that car. For me and my younger sister, the walk up Story Street and across Sydney Road and then through the university school was about 2k. It was usually a lot more on the way home because we'd often get diverted. That's the old arts building there. But sometimes to peep down into dungeon-like laboratories to spy on white-coated scientists with chemicals and lots of glassy apparatus. Or to look for additions to our stamp collection, jumping in, looking for discarded used envelopes in the big Hessian waste paper baskets in the corridors of that particular building. At school, during lunchtime and playtime, we'd call it, we'd kick a footy around made out of paper or socks tied with elastic bands. This is Australian rules football. I didn't know anything about any other sport except football and cricket down in Melbourne because we're completely brainwashed, and I admit that. Sometimes we'd go down to the Melbourne Teachers College cafe if Mum would give me money for lunch that day, and I'd buy a pie and sauce. Absolutely perfect lunch for a young kid. We had to drink the free milk, which came in a crate each morning, but it wasn't too bad on the cold mornings. But I was never an enthusiastic consumer when the milk temperature well exceeded that of the cow's udder. We got it down though. We got it down, even in those hot days. We got it down because we had to get it down. How about the queue for those drinks? Wouldn't like to be thirsty up the back of this one. However, I'm sure that Dr. Duras, who you can see in the foreground, would have done something about that queue had it been a physical education class. When I got home, I'd throw and hit a tennis ball against the wall of our house for hours. And visiting that house some 30 years later, and you probably can see them there on the right-hand side, the marks of those tennis balls were still visible. Or defend my bag of marbles, playing on a bit of hard dirt under a tree in the middle of the street with my neighbourhood friends. I think we paid about 2 shillings and 6pence a week to rent that Parkville house. I remember going back around about 10 years ago and saw that it was up for sale for 1.5 million. I suppose my parents regretted not buying it, but a cream brick house out of the suburbs was everybody's dream in those days. And no one would have guessed anyone would have ever wanted to live so close to the city centre. What I loved to do most was to kick that footy out the back. We didn't have a decent yard, much of it was taken up with a peppercorn tree and an outside loo. But there was some grass at the back, and I'd coax my father out to come out for a kick, especially on Saturdays after we'd returned home from Victoria Park to watch the mighty Magpies, the Collingwood team, play. I knew everything. I knew everything about every Collingwood player, and this is at age 10 and before, and did my best to kick and mark and run like my favourite player at the time, which happened to be this fellow, a fellow called Bobby Rose, who was the captain. Every week we did some sort of sporting activity at that primary school, the little teachers' college practising school, although I didn't even know physical education teachers existed. We had student teachers most of the weeks, and they taught me how to swim at the city bars, and sometimes we walked up to Swanson Street, the opposite end the opposite way to the city bars, to a gymnasium near the cemetery for special exercises on wall bars, mats, horses and rings. I found out during my physical education training that this was called Swedish educational gymnastics. And I was always worried at the time and later on about not doing them properly. But it was a good feeling when I did. These feelings persevered into the Melbourne University physical education course. Bert Willie definitely had us concentrating 100% in Swedish gymnastics on those wall bars, and his eagle eye was on me 100% of the time, I felt, with looking for every little flaw in technique. Competitive sport was unknown for me right through primary school because we never had the numbers to field a team. There weren't even any junior community sport competitions in those days around Parkville. As it turned out, the absence of competition in primary school days didn't seem to do me much harm, which is interesting because in secondary school, team and individual competition seemed to click, and it really surprised me. I've often wondered whether I might have been a more relaxed competitor, even right through my life as a sports person, had I been taught to compete well in primary school. Perhaps a Shane Pill or a Rick Baldock might have done me a bit of good in those days. There's some sport education. In grade 4, I began to learn the piano. The sound of my mates kicking the footy outside the street while I was practising was nothing short of torture. My parents were planning to shift house to the outermost northern suburb of Melbourne, a place called Reservoir. And it's Reservoir, not Reservoir for some of you people. So my father sought a piano teacher in Reservoir for me to attend before we actually shifted to the inner city. As a 10-year-old, I would walk 2 or 3k across to Johnson Street in Carlton, catch a green double-decker bus to Victoria Park Station, catch an old red Rattler train, 7 or 8 stops, walk another 2k to my piano teacher's house up Cheddar Road, it was called, in Reservoir, and after lesson I'd do the same in reverse. To save time if I was late, I'd run with my little backpack of music books, straps tightened up to avoid jumping up and down on my back. I'd get back well after dark, by myself of course, and no one gave this a thought, certainly not me. The one real source of enjoyment was that I would have 3 pence to spend, and we pronounced this threepence in those days. Perhaps the Kiwi visitors here might feel at home. Threepence. It would be spent on potato chips from the fish and chip shops just near the Victoria Park Station, just over the road from the Collingwood Football Club, which I'd lavish with salt and eat on the green bus back up Johnson Street to Carlton. We didn't think too much about diet in those days. I remember enjoying bread and dripping with a bit of salt and pepper. That's the fat from the roast that we'd had the Sunday before. That was when butter was a bit expensive. I was treated to a restaurant once, my first time, when I was 14, and had lamb chops with my grand auntie. A milkshake and a hamburger and a couple of yeast buns and butter from the local cake shop was my idea of a good feed. And we kids, family and schoolmates alike, were as skinny as drovers' dogs, and I haven't changed much. Much of the food is considered nowadays as less than nutritionally sound, but was reasonably well supplemented by meat, cheese, fruit and vegetables from the Victoria market. Sometimes we'd get our fruit and vegetables from an old fellow that came down the street in Parkville called Pio. We called him Pio because that's what he used to yell out, Pio, to announce the arrival of his cart full of fruit and vegetables up Park Street, pulled by a draft horse that looked even older than Pio. 1956 was an exciting year for me. I was to turn 11. Melbourne was host to the Olympic Games. I'd run up to the university track and the Beaurepaire swimming pool on the weekend to hang out at the Cinders track to get autographs of Olympians training there. Unknowns to me, of course, this was the home of the Melbourne University Dip PE course, and Dr. Duras may have been working in his office there at the particular time. Once I took the tram into the city and watched the track and field and swimming on a black and white TV in the Myer Emporium windows. I'd never seen live sport telecast before, and it was very exciting. One day my school got tickets to the MCG, for the Olympics, and I watched the final of the men's 1500 with our champion John Landy, who was the second man to go under 4 minutes in the mile after Roger Bannister, shown on the slide. Roger Bannister, I remember, achieved what we thought was the absolute impossible of running this magical 4-minute mile. But what a runner John Landy was, and what a gentleman. Fancy stopping to pick up a fallen competitor, the future champion Ron Clark, and what has become a famous illustration of sportsmanship. Nowadays, a fallen runner is just someone to avoid tripping over, and one less competitor to worry about in that particular race. I used to go to the MCG and watch the Victorian team play in the Sheffield Shield cricket competition, which is the only first-class cricket in the country, second only to Test cricket in those days. No 50 overs or 20 over big bashes in those particular days, that's for sure. I'd get the tram into the city and walk to the ground, or run if I was late for the 11 a.m. start, scorebook under arm, and sit behind the sight board and score for the whole day. One day, when I was 10, just on that 11, it was 10, would have been 10. I went to see Australia play England, and Frank Typhoon Tyson, shown on the slide, was bowling the fastest and biggest outswingers that I've never or ever seen and ever seen since. And I've played quite a bit of cricket and coached quite a bit of cricket. I could see that ball clearly that day from next to the sight screen 60 metres away. But I was absolutely dismayed when the Australian batsman couldn't. Tyson got 7 for 27. And I know, because I was sitting at the sight screen from the opposite end he was bowling, that 24 of those 27 runs were over and through slips for 4. No third man. 7 for 27, he should have had 7 for 3. That year I got a second-hand bike for Christmas. That was a real bonus, but saved a lot of time, because I usually did the shopping after school, and we'd walk up to the grocer's, then around the next street to the butcher's, on the corner. Sometimes I'd go on to Sydney Road, past Norton's pub, to the newsagent to get the paper and the cigarettes for my father. He knew he shouldn't smoke in those days, but he did anyway. The message of cigarettes were bad for our health wasn't entirely clear to me either, because my favourite film stars all smoked. And they were very handsome and beautiful. And having a cigarette in hand was profoundly sophisticated. Even the rugged cowboys on TV cigarette ads smoked with rousing musical accompaniment. But something told me I shouldn't, and didn't smoke. Though later on, as a young teenager, many of my mates smoked, especially on footy trips. If you didn't smoke, you risked not being cool, although this word wasn't used in those days to describe anything except a drink. So I pretended to draw the smoke in, but I never did. It wasn't cool, but no one ever found out. Something told me it might stop me from doing well on the footy field. It's interesting how things turn out. Later I would play on the Victoria Park Collingwood football ground and play cricket and football, both games on the MCG. I'd be coached by that Frank Typhoon Tyson who ripped Australia apart with that 7 for 27. I'd be appointed coordinator and manager of the Victorian cricket team that I used to adore and still do in many ways. You won't recognise me because I've got a moustache there right in the middle as their coach and coordinator and manager when we won our first Sheffield Shield out of 2 in a row, which was great. It is interesting how things would turn out. I didn't realise I would sit next to John Landy and discuss training and physical education. He became the governor of Victoria, as most of you would know. I would chat to Sir Roger Bannister about Sebastian Coe's training program, particularly and when he should be coming down from altitude before the Olympics. I'd be a physiologist and nutritionist to Australian champion athletes. And I would coach Olympic and Commonwealth Games medalists I really like that slide. Of course, I had no inkling that I would be asked to kick off sports science at the AIS, but that's a story for another day. Just going back, I'll leave that one on a bit. Anyway, this kid of the 50s was obviously a very active kid, walking and running everywhere. He spent the daylight hours hitting, kicking and catching balls, copying the actions of tennis, cricket and football idols. I had some tennis idols as well there, Lou Hode and Ken Rosewall, and those sort of people were fantastic idols and role models for me. His primary school years had him sufficiently fit, that's me I'm talking about, well coordinated of eye, hand and foot, and motivated to enjoy sport right through secondary school and beyond. He learnt to make important decisions about lifestyle that favoured his health. His diet may not have been perfect, but his physical activity seemed to allow him to balance energy in and out very well indeed. The descriptor childhood obesity had not been coined. It's now 55 years since I left secondary school, and the flames of physical activity still flicker strongly. In the last decade, we've talked a lot about being physically literate. I suppose we kids were. We also seem to be reasonably sports literate. And in making strong, conscious decisions like not smoking, there must have been an element, and it's curious as to what contributed to it, a degree of health literacy. But that's all history. Now it's 2017, and a 10-year-old's world is supermarkets, personal laptops, smartphones, Facebook, Twitter, widescreen coloured TVs with remote-controlled in-home movie theatres, streets full of cars, which I never saw, cars full of kids, which I never saw, dishwashers, washing machines, ensuite bathrooms, robots, drones, litigation lawyers, and probably the most significant of all, NAPLAN. Avoiding physical activity has become a driving force in modern economy. Find a way to reduce moderate and physical activity and you find a way to a fortune. You also find a way to taking Mother Nature completely by surprise, and in the process disrupting our physiology and biochemistry. Mother Nature had designed our biochemistry and physiology so that it only worked properly when large muscle groups were regularly engaged. How was Mother Nature to know that in the blink of an evolutionary eyelid, we would no longer rely on regular use of our large muscle groups to survive? Mother Nature is always and will be highly opportunistic, but totally reactionary. She never had and never will have a crystal ball. But as smart as we think we are, it's only human nature that we tend not to see the world, that's our prospective health, that we tend not to see the wood, that's our prospective health, for the trees. That's our present comfort and wealth. Our relentless pursuit of increased wealth and planetary dominance is an innate human drive spinning out of control. It's mediated to a large degree by our politicians, elected via the hip pockets of billions of myopic human beings whose big picture is confined to the concept of never-ending economic growth. And we've inherited DNA that drives us to save energy, not expend it, and to conjure up more and more ways to avoid using our large muscle groups. With our current understanding of the positive interaction of a developing mind and body, and with the obligatory physical activity in decline, restoring the balance through a child's educational experience would seem an obvious course of action. Unfortunately, this has not occurred, at least not in the majority of our schools. Our public primary schools have opted for more classroom teachers, smaller classroom numbers on the premise that this will enhance academic progress. Indeed, all other things being equal, then it should improve numeracy and literacy. But all things aren't equal, and I'll provide evidence of that a little later on. In a nutshell, we and our kids don't need to use our muscles we now and our kids don't need to use our muscles anywhere near as much nowadays. With our DNA instructing us not to waste energy, we don't. This effect is no longer the domain of the mature human being. It's filtered down further and further into childhood. Physical education in schools. Is in the box seat to reprogram DNA expression, we can put it that way. In effect, rekindling and preserving what we might refer to as the play genes. And there would be a set of genes that do instruct us to play as youngsters. The onus is on physical education and sport education to take up the slack and provide children with the motivation, skills, understanding and enjoyment of moving skillfully, to set them on a pathway where physical activity is a sought after and routine part of everyday life. I think I was set on this pathway without my teachers even trying, but that was 60 years ago and wouldn't work now. So things change. Now what I'd like to talk about is 3 different sections. The first one being, or the second chapter, if you like, of this 5-chapter talk, on a few observations from physical education people. I'll go through these fairly quickly, but physical education in general doesn't seem to enjoy the status of other school subjects. We know there's a concern about a decline in school-based physical activity. That coincides with concerns with the delivery of PE. Across Australia, 4 out of 5 physical education classes, if we ever assumed we had daily physical education, would be taught by generalist classroom teachers, even if there was a specialist at the school who would only take 1 class per week of any particular child. And that's a role with which many feel uncomfortable. The classroom teachers feel uncomfortable. With increased administrative and curricular responsibilities, and with publicly scrutinised national literacy and numeracy assessments, which exert a profound effect on teaching practices, classroom teachers are likely to reduce or even forego their PE teaching responsibilities. And I found out from moving around lots of primary schools that that is certainly the case. Contributing further to a relative decline in PE, school principals are likely to choose classroom teachers rather than PE teachers simply to reduce those class numbers. In response to this general decline in primary school physical education over the decades since I left, a lot of researchers and physical educators have embarked on programs to try to convince our policymakers to rethink physical education. But to be convincing, really, the investigations needed to be conducted over several years of primary school rather than any short-term intervention which may produce transient outcomes. So what do we know up until 2005? It's prior to the study that we embarked on here in Australia called the Lifestyle of Our Kids study, the LOOK study. Well, prior to 2005, there were 4 randomised controlled trials of the effect of physical education over 2 years or more. And talking to policymakers in recent years, I do know that they want information that is shown to be sustainable. They were the Trois-Rivières study, Canada, the SPARK study, the CATCH study, and the Healthy PE study, which did use some nutrition as well as the intervention, and slightly older kids than primary school kids, but the others were primary school. Each of those introduced physical education in schools for between 2 and 3 and 4 years. Collectively, these studies showed three things. They showed that you, with instruction and good physical education, could improve in-class physical activity and physical education. They also showed, to a certain degree, but not all the studies, improvements in fitness and motor skill, more so the latter. They showed, importantly in those days, certainly I remember Roy Shepherd from the Trial-Riviere study talking to me many years ago, that physical education, he said, Dick, will not impede academic progress. But those studies had no effect on obesity. Introducing physical education had no effect on obesity, did not affect habitual or week-to-week physical activity. And for two of those studies, where their main objective was to reduce the risk of chronic disease through some blood tests, there were no effects found. Physical education was found not to have any effect whatsoever. And at least in Australia and most of the places over in America and Canada, there was little influence on the policymakers of primary school PE. But we decided to have a more thorough look at what sustained physical education might achieve. The Look randomised controlled trial asked two questions, one of which we're going to talk about today. Can primary school specialist PE influence health, physical and psychological development? Secondly, and very importantly, how important is sport, physical activity and physical education through childhood and adolescence to quality of life in old age? The number of people older than 85 is increasing dramatically now. It's going to be quality of life in people of age 80 to 100 in the years to come is going to be the biggest, one of the biggest problems, I would say, the government's going to have, economically and socially. The Look study design, it commenced in 2005. We had 850 kids from 29 ACT schools. 13 schools, we introduced 2 physical education classes per week. I'll talk about that in a minute. And that was over a 4-year period. 16 schools in the control group continued with normal PE and sport practices taken by classroom teachers only. There were very, very few, and in this particular study there were no specialist physical education teachers in those primary schools in the ACT. Still aren't. Socioeconomic status is about 10% higher than the Australian average of those kids. I've mentioned that because in our model we have to adjust for those sorts of things to make sure we're inferring properly. We took measurements at the ages of 8 years, 10, 12 and 16. The kids are now going on 20. Our next measurements are going to be at the age of 25. And even though I won't be writing up the papers, we'll follow those people through the age of 80. Each of those circles on the left-hand side up there represent a little team that we had to look at a particular area of physical and psychological development of the children. We had nutritionists looking at all of the dietary activities, because it's pointless trying to tell someone like a politician that physical activity is going to do this if we hadn't controlled for nutrition, for example, or if we didn't control for socioeconomic status, or we didn't control for this, that and the other. The advantage of doing a study like this is we can set up a statistical model and make sure our inferences are as close to being as correct as we could ever possibly be. It was designed by this physical education was designed by physical education and movement scientists at the Blue Earth Foundation, who set up a terrific program. It was one that satisfied all of the ideas of physical education I would have had, and I think would have satisfied Dr. Duras. It was aimed at engaging all children fully and equally, and had an exploratory and enjoyable, had to be exploratory and enjoyable because it had to be sustainable. We didn't want to look at a physical training program where you can get kids fit in 6 weeks, or try to, and then they drop it. That's not what it's all about. We were looking at physical education. But this physical education had no specific strategy to reduce obesity. They didn't mention the word, as far as I know, diet once. They had no specific strategy they wouldn't have even known I was looking at chronic disease factors. Or they didn't even think about trying to get the kids more active during the week. They were delivering 2 45-minute classes of physical education to do what we think physical education should do, to educate those kids properly through the physical medium. In this presentation, I'm going to focus attention on the health benefits, not because they're more important, because they're not. But I've found out over the years, when talking to politicians and policymakers in the education departments, if we find we're putting our kids at earlier, higher risk of chronic disease, then this is something that policymakers in health and education just can't ignore. Some background on our cohort. Kids were typical. The recommended 60 minutes of moderate vigorous physical activity a day is achieved by only 30% of the boys, 16% of the 12-year-old girls. By the way, all but one aspect that I speak about here comes from peer-reviewed published research. There's one new piece of information I'm going to give you which we haven't actually had published yet, but is in preparation. How did the kids shape up? Not well. 23% of the girls, 26% of the boys are classified as overweight and obese by the usual BMI standards. But I want to make one point here. If anybody's thinking about doing any research, looking at longitudinal aspects of changes in body composition, don't go near BMI. They can give you results that are exactly the opposite of the ones that are the truth. Ridiculous. And how many papers have been published in some of these journals that have done that? I shake my head. Need we be concerned about the risk of chronic disease in a healthy group of Australians, especially those living in an environment like the ACT? Yep, we certainly do, because 23% of all those boys and 31% of the girls had borderline or elevated insulin resistance, signifying increased type 2 diabetes later in life, increased risk. And 19% or 20% of the boys and 16% of the girls had low-density lipoprotein, cholesterol levels considered at risk by the American Medical Association for kids at this age. That's the ACT. So the question we asked was, could a general and sustainable program of physical education in primary school make an impact on the early indicators of chronic disease on children as they enter secondary school? I just talked about the design of the study, the intervention group and the control group. Very, very important to do randomised control of this work. I, for one, will never be doing any reviews of any subject or any observatory type research in any subject, because I know the only way I can convince people is doing randomised controlled trials where we've got control groups controlling for things that don't make or don't have an impact on our inferences. Did 2 physical education classes per week make a difference to insulin resistance? There's one of the little girls originally in the study, many years ago now, getting the bloods taken at the start of the day. Yes, it did. With no differences in insulin resistance at baseline, by the end of grade 6, the end of the 4-year intervention with a 2 45-minute class of physical education from the Blue Earth Foundation, 31% of the children in the control group had elevated insulin resistance, but only 22% of the children in the intervention group. Physical education had an impact on cholesterol as well. With no differences at baseline, by the end of grade 6, 23% of the control group had elevated LDL cholesterol, but only 14% of the children in the intervention group. Remembering this is only on 2 classes a week and nothing else in the school. Did it have any impact on bone development? Yep. Even without any specific weight-bearing exercise, by grade 6, there's a 5% greater mid-radius cortical area and 9% greater mid-tibia cortical area, but only in the girls. When I say only in the girls, we were pretty rapt to see it in the girls. This is the part that I've just written the paper. I'm giving it to my colleague, cardiologist Walter Bayaratner, to go through before we put it into circulation, hopefully. What about heart development? A lower left ventricle relative wall thickness is desirable from both a heart health and an aerobic point of view. A lower left ventricle wall thickness really just means that the walls of the left ventricle, you can see there, become relatively greater than the chamber. And that's not good. And the specialist physical education did have an effect, but again in the girls. But for the see it effect, I just could not believe it. Relative wall thickness decreased 12.5% in the intervention group, which is great. You get that adaptation over those 4 years between 8 and 12 in the girls, compared with only 2% in the control group. So it's impacting on cardiac modelling, physical education itself, just physical education, not physical training, not doing exercise, not training hard. The 2 physical education classes sustained over 4 years. I used to get this a lot from the teachers during the study. But does taking time out for PE and sport really detract from NAPLAN? To find out, it's pretty easy for us to find out. We measured the improvements in NAPLAN between grade 3 and 5 in our intervention and control groups, and found that specialist PE improves NAPLAN scores, especially numeracy, by between 13 and 9 points, which is about the same number of points that our Minister for Education was saying here he was going to achieve by introducing 20 new specialist numeracy teachers into ACT schools. We did it, I was able to tell him, through 4 years of physical education. Randomised controlled trial stuff. Interestingly, the teachers said they thought the children in the intervention school, they made comments to me, we didn't go and ask you for comments during the time, they were concentrating better in class during those years. What about schools which generally encourage sport and physical activity? What about the climate of physical activity in schools? We asked a question which wasn't related to the randomised controlled trial, but do fit in more active schools. Does a school that has better results in our fitness tests and our physical activity measurements through the fitness test was just the shuttle run, couldn't do much more. The physical activity test was accelerometers and questionnaires and pedometers. So that was pretty well objective. Well, it certainly did. I was able to amaze some principals by predicting their NAPLAN scores, knowing what the fitness score of their school was. There's a relationship. Each one of those circles, I hope you can see those there, is a school. And on the y-axis we've got the numeracy. It could have been reading, it could have been writing for the NAPLAN scores that particular year. And on the x-axis we've got the what's that modelling, the square root of the cardiorespiratory test we did, just the running test. So the fitter schools were getting better NAPLAN scores. That's adjusted for the socio-economic area they were living in and a whole lot of other things. So I'm positive that's correct. Almost positive. You can't be positive in science about anything really. So now we know that quality physical education in primary schools will have our children entering secondary school with a lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes, a lower risk of developing cardiovascular disease, a favourable bone and heart remodelling in girls, favourable bone and heart remodelling, enhanced numeracy and literacy. It's not bad. And note these effects, this is interesting. These effects occurred despite there being no overall effect on general day-to-day physical activity. Everyone's hunting to improve day-to-day physical activity, getting the levels of physical activity, of habitual physical activity improved. But we got those results without any day-to-day changes in physical activity, no week-to-week, just the physical activity spikes. I sort of liken this to the runners that I coach nowadays. They'll be flogging outside in 37 degrees over at the Institute of Sport later on. We train them, then we rest them, train them and rest them. Now, the physical education is not training, but it's giving them a spike of physical activity and teaching them about things. And that over a 4-year period made these differences. From the other more concerning point of view, our current system of public primary school systems, not just the public schools, other schools as well, but mainly the public ones we've been looking at, has our children currently entering school, the current system we've got in primary schools, with a high risk of developing type 2 diabetes. Now imagine me with a politician, with my papers, that's what I've had to do. If you don't do this, this is going to happen. You have a higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes, a higher risk of developing cardiovascular disease, less favourable bone and heart remodelling, lower numeracy. And do you want that to happen, Minister? How can you? So they gave me some money to do another trial, which I'll talk about a bit later on. Taking action. We called this, well, my son Rowan called this, the people trial. I thought, fair enough. The physical education, physical literacy trial. And they're the trials that we're running now to put the results of that last look study into action, to try to convince the Victorian education system to think more about physical education in primary schools. We had to come up with a way to do that. I talked to a lot of people and came up with some ideas with my research group. And we decided that having one qualified, well, we know that having one qualified PE teacher in every public primary school is commendable, and some states go close. But this is not the solution, because it happens in some of the states now where we're getting similar results to what I found before. One PE teacher in an average-sized primary school can teach each class just once a week. Now, I've mentioned before in the ACT they don't even have one, maybe a couple of schools out of many. One practically, and this is something I want you to think about because it's what we've worked out, and people come up with reasons we shouldn't be doing it. Well, I guess it's a bit late for the trial, but willing to listen. One practically and economically realistic situation we reckon will work is called the physical education, physical literacy, the people system, where we introduce a physical literacy coach, a qualified and experienced specialist physical educator, into a group of 8 schools with no fixed class responsibilities. And the role of that person is to provide in-class and ACHPER-linked professional development to classroom teachers. The most important one, first up, will be linking with the principal, staff and school board to develop a school climate charter of physical activity. Link the classroom teacher with the resident PE specialist very, very closely, so it's a team effort. Align the Australian Sports Commission sporting skills program with the physical education curriculum. And link students, the kids at the school, with community sport and recreation. To test this system, we set up 2 trials. We've done one of them. We did one in 2015 in the Broadmeadows district, which is in the northwestern suburbs of Melbourne. That was completed in 2015. The next one we do is this year in the Geelong and Surf Coast districts, conducted, we start in February. I'm not going to dwell on this because it's just to let you know we've got a bit of a system we adhere to in these trials. But the first part, at stage 1, of going through the trial, and remember we're only trialling this for 1 year when the physical literacy coach, that trained physical educator that we gave that role to, will have 6 years for a kid and a decade for the teachers to educate. We've only got 1 year to look at our trial. That's a problem with looking at samples and doing the statistics and organising our work as efficiently as possible. But one of the first things we're going to be doing with this trial is making sure the principals are on board in developing the school climate and agreeing that this is what has to happen. And how could they not when we give them that information that I've just given to you? How could they say no? Well, we've gone to 30 principals, or no, there was only about 19 principals for the first trial. None of them said no. Time doesn't allow a presentation of the Broadmeadows results here, but we're very pleased with the outcomes, especially in relation to the socialisation benefits. And here I am giving you all this information about the health benefits. Now I'll talk about the socialisation benefits. But I can give you a couple of comments, a couple of teacher comments. Perhaps just read those. You're listening to my voice. That's classroom teachers at the end of the Broadmeadows trial. A couple of students. We did some qualitative research, of course, well not of course, but we did. And we've got 50 or 100 of comments like this from the kids, and all along the same lines. This man was the first physical literacy coach we employed to do the Broadmeadows study. A fellow called Ron Rooney. It's funny because I actually taught Ron at Broadmeadows High School when I was teaching physical education there. And he was the little kid that used to make sure my class was set up before I came out. Funnily enough, he sort of followed me and I followed him all the way through his career, and he helped me with the Victorian cricket team as well. And I actually coached him football in a club. So it's just amazing. But this is what he said. And I'll read this because it's good. In my close to 40 years of teaching and coaching, this year has been the most enjoyable of all. To be able to interact with generalist classroom teachers the way this position allowed me to, and to see the change in their attitudes to physical activity and sport, along with the benefits to children, was extremely rewarding educationally. During the year, the way the children responded was personally gratifying, especially when several of the children who became leaders of physical activities in and out of school were those with previous behavioural problems in that school environment. If anyone knows that school environment, with 50% of the kids, 40% of the kids coming from Middle Eastern countries, you'll know that was a big achievement. Here we modify, the next trial is the Geelong district, Geelong and Surf Coast district, and our focus of attention, looking at our results of the first trial, is going to be more and more on the classroom teacher effectiveness. If we just got the one result, that the classroom teacher was now motivated to take PE, which most of them aren't. Average amount of physical education by classroom teachers in the ACT, where we did a sort of a survey. It was done pretty well, a little bit clandestine, I must admit, was 7 minutes a day on average. 28 minutes a week. A lot of schools didn't do any. Interestingly, Richard Tinning, who a lot of you would know is a very well-respected physical educator, went through the Diploma of Physical Education course with John Evans and other people around my time, but not in my year. He said that his thesis examined the nature and status of physical education in Geelong primary schools. I know this is a while back, because it was in 2008 when he gave this Dean's Lecture Series, which was devoted to Professor Duras as well, at the University of Melbourne. Our 2017 physical education, physical literacy coach is a fellow that a lot of you would know is Andy Hare. I didn't know Andy, not being right into the physical education scene, but if I had been right into the physical education scene and reading it rather than the physiology and biochemistry and cardiology I was reading every day, I would have known Andy. And we're very, very pleased to have Andy working as our coach in 2017. Before I wind up, I have some people to thank in regards to our research, but I can only mention a few. To Rowan and Lisa and Walter, well, I've said it there. The Blue Earth Foundation and staff, particularly Malcolm Freak, for instilling a love of physical movement in the lives of many Australian children. As a man with a vision that first rang me from London, he said, "Dick, I used to play footy with you, but I was 2 years behind in age, and you won't remember me, but I want to try and do something for Australian kids," and this eventuated. That was a long time ago, 1998. The Commonwealth Education Trust Board gave us the money to do that look research, or a lot of it anyway. And its chair, Judith Hanratty, who came from New Zealand originally and was a very, very good golfer. Another inspiring woman, really saw that we could help, and I had to report some of these results to the education people and the heads of Commonwealth countries over in London. Finishing up, back on my notes. Epilogue. We're back in 1964. Remember that lecture that I introduced right at the start? The little weedy phys ed teacher, phys ed student or disciple, Telford, was in that lecture. It was presented by Prof Duras, and as it sadly turned out, just a year ago or so before his death. I mentioned before that there were two fond memories of this lecture. The first came halfway through the lecture when a couple of rowdy students, clearly not of PE ethnicity, and perhaps vocally lubricated from a session over the road at Norton's pub, lobbed a couple of plain bread rolls down towards Prof Duras's lectern. I got it right this time. I went back and checked a few of the mates there, Peter. Unfortunately, these bread throwers are in the wrong place at the wrong time. A perceived show of disrespect to our special lecturer prompted a quiet but decisive response. Two of our group, one I distinctly remember being an aptly nicknamed chap called Moose Russell, had intercepted the two intruders as they scampered away outside to politely request they return to the theatre to retrieve their bread rolls and apologise to Prof Duras. They did, and with feeling. I estimate this incident had been initiated and finalised within 2 minutes, and Dr Duras resumed his lecture seamlessly with a smile, perhaps introducing a full stop and a new sentence to his notes. I was reminded of the second fond memory of Dr Duras's lecture just a couple of months back in a reunion with one of my long-time PE mates of that year. Dr Duras finished the lecture with a question. Remember, this is 1963. How do you distinguish a male chromosome from a female chromosome? It's probably a really old joke now, but it wasn't in those days, and maybe it wasn't a joke we thought then. He challenged us. We scratched our heads thinking of the funny blue shapes we'd seen on the slides of X and Y chromosomes in those days. The wry smile we thought signified that he stumped us with a new finding in this exciting new area of human physiology, but he hadn't stumped us at all. It wasn't the case. Australia's father of physical education told us with an even bigger smile, you should have known the answer to that one. The difference is very clear. It's all in their genes. At the time, it got us. I can tell you that right now. It's only fitting that we finish with one of the numerous insightful quotes from Dr Duras, each of which would have been relevant to anything I've said today. I could have picked out a lot, but I picked out something from that newspaper article in the Melbourne Herald. I used to read the front page very rarely in the Melbourne Herald, but the back page I knew pretty well. 1937, I didn't read it too well in 1937. But in the playgrounds then, let the children play to their heart's content. As they grow older, bring in the games and the rules. In that way, the sense of self-discipline will be educated, and they'll discover that discipline, law and order is necessary for even children to work and play together. The socialisation of physical education, the educational aspects of physical education are eminently important. So thank you for joining with me and the National State Boards and staff of ACHPER for honouring Dr Fritz Duras. Thank you very much for coming, Duras family. And thank you to everyone here for your own contribution to physical education, but as I've said here, so far. Thanks very much.